The moment Camille Quinn pulled back the velvet curtain, concealing her finished canvas, she felt the entire court of Valdris go silent in a way that had nothing to do with politeness and everything to do with terror. 300 vampires stood in the grand hall beneath crystal chandeliers that burned with cold blue flame, their pale faces turned toward her work, their ancient eyes wide with something she had never seen in immortal faces before. Fear, raw. Genuine, throat-tightening fear. Camille held the edge of the canvas aframe and kept her chin up. She had spent 6 months inside this court as its commissioned artist, invited by the Council of Pale Hands to paint a ceremonial portrait for the Solstice Hall, the one event each century where vampire nobility from every bloodline in Europe gathered beneath one roof to negotiate, posture, and occasionally destroy one another. She had been introduced to everyone as the human artist, a curiosity, a clever mortal with a paintbrush, nothing more, but the crest she had painted, hidden in the deep background of the composition. Layered beneath a wash of midnight blue and shadow the way she always hid the real meaning of her work, was not the crest of the council, it was the crest of Corvin Darkmoor, king of the Darkmoor bloodline, the oldest, most feared, and most deliberately absent vampire ruler in the known world, the silver serpent coiling around a black thorn crown. The 3 stars of the northern blood law. The cracked moon that signified an ancient vow made before any of the vampires in this room had been born. Countess Seraphine Voss was the first to speak, and her voice came out like shattered glass. "Where did you see that mark?" Camille did not lower her gaze. "I painted what I was asked to paint. No human living knows that crest," said Lord Malachar Veth. From somewhere to her left, his voice a silken thread of menace. That symbol was sealed from all records 3 centuries ago. The blood laws themselves forbid its display. Then someone forgot to tell the man who showed it to me, Camille said. The hall erupted. She had expected noise. She had not expected the temperature in the room to drop 10 degrees, or for the blue flames in the chandeliers to flicker in unison, or for every guard at every door to reach simultaneously for the short iron blades they carried at their hips. The ones laced with elder ash that could put even the oldest vampire on their knees. She had absolutely not expected the main doors at the far end of the hall to open. He walked in like winter given a body and a reason to move. Corvin Darkmoor was not what she had imagined when he had stood in her private studio 4 weeks ago and commissioned the hidden detail. She had imagined something older, colder, more obviously terrifying, and he was all of those things. But he was also devastatingly present in a way she had not been prepared for. 6'3", white hair swept back from a face that looked carved from pale marble, eyes the color of iron before it oxidized, silver gray and depthless. He wore a dark coat that swept the floor and made the court nobles look like they were dressed for a costume party in comparison. Every inch of him radiated the specific confidence of someone who had not asked permission for anything in several centuries. The hall did not just go silent. It contracted. Vampires who had been standing straight seemed to lose a centimeter of height without meaning to. Corvin walked directly toward Camille, not toward the council's dais, not toward the countess, not toward anyone or anything else in the room. He stopped 3 feet from her and looked at the painting. Then he looked at her. "You hid it deeper than I asked," he said. His voice was low, private, even in the enormous hall. "The 3rd layer, I can barely see it." "I always hide the truth in the 3rd layer," Camille said, and her voice only shook a little. "I thought that was the point." It was. Something moved through his iron eyes. Not warmth, exactly, but the recognition of warmth, the memory of it. "You did well, Camille Quinn." The way he said her full name was not casual, it was deliberate. A declaration to every vampire in the room that he knew her name, that he had chosen to be here, that whatever came next was intentional. Countess Seraphine stepped forward, her silver gown catching the blue light like armor. She was ancient enough that even Camille could feel the pressure of her presence, a psychic weight that pushed against the temples like weather before a storm. "Corvin, you have violated the Accord of 3 Shores. Your bloodline was sealed from this court by the blood law I myself signed," Corvin said, still not looking at Seraphine. "Yes, I am aware of what I signed. I am also aware that it was signed under coercion by the very council standing in this room, and that the evidence of that coercion has been hidden in a painting hanging in your own ceremonial hall for the last 3 hours. He finally turned to look at the Countess, and even from beside him, Camille felt the shift in the air. "Tell me, Seraphine, would you like to have that conversation now, in front of every noble house on the continent? Or shall we find a more private arrangement?" The silence that followed was the kind that had weight and texture. The kind you could drown in. Camille exhaled slowly and reminded herself that she had known, walking into this hall tonight, that this was not a portrait unveiling. It was a trap being sprung, and she had agreed to be the one holding the wire. She had just not entirely understood, until this moment, what it would feel like to stand this close to the man who had asked her to spring it. 4 weeks earlier, her studio had smelled of turpentine and cold coffee, and Camille had been arguing with a canvas that refused to cooperate. She lived and worked in a converted railway arch in East London, the kind of industrial space that was simultaneously freezing in winter, sweltering in summer, and perfect for painting at 2 in the morning, which was when she did her best work. High ceilings, bare brick. 3 oversized windows that faced northeast and let in the grey London light she had built her entire aesthetic around. She had been in the human world of vampire awareness for 3 years. Since a client had commissioned a portrait and turned out to be a vampire, and had then, apparently impressed by Camille's complete failure to panic when his eyes had gone silver during the sitting, recommended her to others. She painted for both worlds now. She was known in certain circles as the mortal artist who could be trusted with secrets, because she was clever enough to understand that secrets kept you alive, and alive was her preferred state of being. She had not expected the knock at midnight. She had definitely not expected to open the door and find Corvin Darkmoor on the other side of it. He had not introduced himself by name at first. He had introduced himself the way vampires of his particular level of power always did, by simply being present in a way that rearranged the room around him, that made Camille's studio suddenly feel like a waiting room for something enormous. He had looked at her work on the walls for a long time without speaking. She had let him, because she had learned that with certain clients, silence was the whole audition. "You painted the underground market in Prague," he had said finally, stopping in front of a large canvas she had done the previous year. It showed a midnight street market that did not appear on any map, stalls selling things that only made sense if you already knew what world they belonged to. She had captured it in shades of deep violet and amber, the supernatural economy of a hidden city rendered in brushstrokes that implied rather than stated. "I spent 2 weeks there," she had said. "It took me 4 attempts to get a human artist to enter that market without running." He had turned to look at her then, and she had understood, in the way you understand something that cannot be taught, that this was not an ordinary commission. "You did not run." "I have very good boots," Camille had said. "They make running seem like too much effort." Something had flickered at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, the structural suggestion of one. He had explained the commission over the next hour, sitting at her work table with his hands folded and his voice so precisely measured that she had started mentally filing it alongside the voices of professors and lawyers, people who understood that the way you delivered information was as important as the information itself. He needed a painting for the Solstice Hall. He needed something that would pass the scrutiny of the council's curators, who would inspect every work before it hung. And he needed something hidden inside it that would only be visible to someone who knew to look at the precise angle of light, at the precise distance, once the hall was full and the occasion was already underway. The Crest, he had said, and he had drawn it for her on paper, his handwriting the kind of architectural, controlled script that made you think of documents signed in candlelight centuries ago. "This belongs to my bloodline. It was erased from all official records by the Council of Pale Hands 37 years ago, after they forced me to sign an accord that exiled my bloodline from attending any formal court proceedings. They did this," he had said with a quietness that was somehow louder than fury, "because they possess documentation that proves the Countess Seraphine Voss orchestrated the poisoning of 3 allied bloodlines to consolidate her position on the council. Documentation they have been trying to destroy for 4 decades. Camille had looked at the crest on the paper, then at him. "And you need me to walk into their court," she had said, "and hang evidence of your existence in their own hall. I need you to be invited where I cannot go," he had said. "You are human, You are not bound by the blood law that seals me from their proceedings. You are a commissioned artist with legitimate credentials and a reputation for discretion. If you accept this, you will be placing yourself in considerable danger, and I want you to understand that before you agree to anything." She had looked at him for a long moment. The marble-pale face, the iron eyes that held something she could not name yet, something old and careful, and underneath all of it, remarkably honest. "What happens to you if it works?" she had asked. "The blood law that was imposed on me becomes publicly contestable. Every noble house on the continent will be forced to acknowledge that the Accord of Three Shores was signed under the coercion of a documented criminal. The exile becomes void. And what happens to me if it does not work?" A pause, clean and unambiguous. "I have made certain arrangements," he had said, "to ensure that whatever happens in that hall, you leave it safely. I give you my word on this." She had looked at the crest again. She had thought about what it meant to be trusted with a secret that had survived 4 decades. She had thought about the painting she could make, the layers, the hidden geometry, the way light could carry a message that words could not. "I will need a full account of what the crest represents," she had said. "Every element. I paint what things mean, not just what they look like. I will need to understand this." He had begun to explain. They had talked until 4 in the morning. He had come back the next night. And the night after that, by the second week, the painting had been nearly complete, and the conversations had expanded far beyond the commission. She had asked him about the Northern blood law, and he had explained it with the patience of someone who had watched it, written and amended, and weaponized across centuries. She had asked him about the cracked moon on the crest, the ancient vow it represented, and he had told her about it without evasion, about a promise made to a bloodline long in exchange, a vow that survived the death of everyone who remembered making it because he remembered it, and because he chose to. "You carry their memory," she had said. "It is the only thing I can still give them," he had said. She had gone back to the canvas and worked in silence for a while, and she had felt his gaze on her back, steady and undemanding, and she had thought that was perhaps the most surprising thing about him. He did not demand, he requested, he explained. He was underneath the weight of his presence and the cold perfection of his face, someone who asked rather than assumed. By the 3rd week, she had finished the painting, and she had also finished pretending she did not think about him between his visits. He had come to see the completed work, and had stood before it for several minutes without speaking, and then he had said very quietly, "It is extraordinary. It is the best thing I have ever painted," she had said honestly, and it was true. And they had both known that part of the reason it was the best thing she had ever painted was that she had understood what it needed to mean. He had looked at her then, with those iron eyes, and said, "Camille, I need to tell you something about the night of the unveiling, about what I intend to do and what the risk is. Not just for you, for both of us." "You are coming," she had said. It was not quite a question. "The blood law forbids me from attending the court proceedings. It does not forbid me from entering the building the moment the proceedings have been disrupted." His jaw had tightened fractionally. "There is a distinction in the letter of the law that I have spent 37 years examining. A loophole," she had said. "A very precisely identified one." He had paused. "I will be in the building from the moment the curtain is drawn. If anything goes wrong before I can reach you, there are people in that hall who are loyal to my bloodline rather than to the council, and they have been briefed." She had absorbed this. Then she had said, "You have been planning this for a long time. I have been waiting for the right artist," he had said, and the way he said it was not flattery. It was a statement of fact delivered with a weight that she felt in her sternum. She had nodded, and then, because she was Camille Quinn and she had learned 3 years ago that the most dangerous thing in any room was usually also the most interesting thing in any room, she had said, "Then I suppose we do this together." The look on his face in that moment was something she had painted, privately, just for herself, in a small sketchbook she kept under the work table. She had not told him that, back in the hall, with 300 vampires reconfiguring their allegiances, in real time, Corvin positioned himself beside her, and slightly in front of her, which she noticed, and which she had the complicated feeling she was going to have to address at some point, because she was perfectly capable of standing beside rather than behind. But for this particular moment, she let it go, because Countess Seraphine's expression had shifted from outrage to calculation, which was significantly more dangerous. "The painting is a fabrication," Seraphine said, her voice smooth as polished bone. "The human was paid to produce a forgery, a provocation. This is theatre, Corvin, and the court sees through it." "Does it?" Lord Aldrevian of House Cressholm, an ancient noble with pewter white hair down to his shoulders, and the kind of face that had witnessed empires fall without blinking, stepped forward from the crowd. His voice carried the specific gravity of someone who was accustomed to being the oldest person in any room. "I would suggest, Countess, that you be very careful about what you dismiss as theatre. I was present at the signing of the Accord of Three Shores. I was told Corvin signed willingly." "He did," Seraphine said. "I signed," Corfinson said, his voice carrying effortlessly across the hall, "because you were holding 3 of my bloodline's youngest members in a sealed chamber beneath the council hall, with a blood lock on the door. I signed because my signature was the only thing that would open that lock before dawn." His tone was not heated. It was precise, each word placed with the care of someone who had rehearsed this moment for decades and refused to let emotion make it careless. "I signed and you released them. And then you spent 37 years telling every court on the continent that I had submitted willingly to the exile, that my bloodline had conceded the northern territories out of respect for the council's authority." The silence in the hall had a different quality now. Not the terror of the first moments, something more complicated. The silence of very old, very political creatures recalculating the foundations of what they had been told. Camille felt the shift and did not allow herself to look relieved. "Not yet. You have no proof," Seraphine said. "I have a painting hanging in your ceremonial hall," Corvin said, "visible to every bloodline representative on this continent. A painting bearing the Darkmoor crest in the context of the Accord of Three Shores, which is sufficient under the Court Code of Ancient Record to trigger a formal review. You can dispute the content of that review. You cannot prevent it from happening. The code is older than the Accord, and I suspect Lord Aldrevian is aware of that." Lord Aldrevian inclined his head slowly. It was not agreement exactly, it was acknowledgement. In Vampire Court, that was frequently more powerful. Seraphine turned her gaze to Camille, and Camille felt it like a physical pressure, like 2 hands against the sides of her skull. The Countess was not using power on her, not yet. She was simply letting her know that the option existed. "The human," Seraphine said softly, "is extraordinarily naive if she believes she walks out of this hall tonight." Corvin moved. It was not dramatic. It was simply a rearrangement of his body, half a step forward, so that he was between Camille and the Countess, and his voice when he spoke had a quality she had not heard from him before. It was still controlled, but beneath the control was something vast and cold and very, very old. "If you make any move toward Camille Quinn," he said, "you will be teaching every bloodline in this room that the Council of Pale Hands threatens civilians for performing a commissioned service. You will be providing me with a second and considerably simpler reason to tear down everything you have built here." A pause. "I have lived for a very long time, Seraphine. I am patient, but I am not unlimited in my patience, and I want you to understand, very clearly, that this human is under my protection. My personal protection, not my bloodlines. Mine." The distinction registered. Camille could see it in the way the nearest vampires shifted their weight. The tiny recalibration that happened when ancient creatures updated their threat assessments. A vampire king's personal protection was not a diplomatic courtesy. It was a blood vow in everything but the formal invocation. In the old world codes, it meant that harm to the protected individual was equivalent to an attack on the king himself, with all the consequent entitlements to retaliation. Seraphine's jaw tightened. The calculation in her eyes continued. From the back of the hall, a second vampire stepped forward. He was shorter than most of the others, with close-cropped white hair and the kind of angular face that made him look simultaneously young and geological, the face of someone who had been that age for a very long time. He wore a coat with the deep burgundy lining that Camille had learned to associate with House Cerrevault, the Council's primary enforcement body. "Lord Theron," Corvin said, without turning around. He appeared to have a comprehensive awareness of the hall at all times, which Camille filed under things she needed to ask him about later. "Corvin." Lord Theron's voice was surprisingly mild. The Countess's position is compromised by the public nature of this event. I think we all recognize that. He looked around the hall with an expression of faint weariness, as if the political machinations of the room were a particularly repetitive card game he had agreed to play out of politeness. A review is warranted. The code provides for it. I suggest we proceed accordingly and allow the council to convene within the 48-hour period that the code also specifies. He paused. And I suggest that the human artist be extended the customary safe passage that applies to civilian witnesses' code proceedings. Countess? The word was mild. The question it contained was not. Seraphine looked at Corvin, at the painting, at the hall full of vampire nobility doing very attentive political calculations. Safe passage, she said in the voice of someone swallowing something sharp. Granted. Camille breathed. The next 48 hours were not restful. Corvin's people, a small and extremely efficient group of 3 vampires, who communicated mostly in glances and brief nods, and who treated Camille with a particular courtesy of people who had been very thoroughly briefed to do so, relocated her to a private suite in the same building as the court. The building was a restored Victorian hotel in the Kensington district of London, the kind of place with mahogany panelling and brass fixtures, and absolutely no online presence whatsoever, because it did not cater to the kind of guests who posted reviews. Camille had brought a sketchbook. She always brought her sketchbook. She was filling it with preparatory drawings of the hall as she had seen it, capturing the architectural details while they were still fresh. When the knock came at her door at 1 a.m, she knew who it was before she opened it. Corvin stood in the corridor with his coat over one arm, and an expression that was, for the first time since she had met him, something other than controlled. He looked tired in the way that ancient creatures looked tired, not physically exhausted, but weighted, as if the last several hours had required the expenditure of something that did not replenish easily. "Come in," she said. He came in, and she noticed that he looked at the room with the specific attention of someone assessing it for exits and vulnerabilities before he allowed himself to focus on her. It was not a conscious performance, it was simply what he did. She had noticed it in her studio as well. He was always, on some level, making sure the space around her was safe before he engaged with anything else in it. She found that she did not know what to do with this feeling, so she poured him a glass of the crimson liquid from the decanter the staff had left on the sideboard without comment, and she poured herself a glass of water, and she sat back down at the writing desk with her sketchbook. "The council convenes at noon tomorrow," he said, taking the glass, and not drinking from it, just holding it. "Technically I am excluded from attending, but the code review process requires the presence of the instigating party, and I am the instigating party. There will be a procedural argument about this before anything substantive happens." "How long will the procedural argument take?" "Several hours, most likely." He glanced at her sketchbook. "May I?" She handed it to him. He looked at the drawings of the hall, the architectural studies, the quick figure sketches she had done of various court members during the unveiling. He turned the pages slowly. He stopped on a page near the back. She had drawn him. Standing at her studio window at 3 a.m, his profile half in shadow, the London dark behind him. She had done it from memory, which meant it was intimate in the way that memory is always intimate. He looked at it for a long moment without speaking. "I am sorry," she said. "I draw what I see. I draw what stays with me. You can consider it a professional hazard." "Do not apologize," he said very quietly. He looked up from the sketchbook, and the tiredness in his face had given way to something which she'd recognized from the commission conversation, that honest, unguarded quality that appeared when he stopped measuring his words. "You drew me as if I were something worth looking at." "You are," Camille said with the directness that was simply the way she was built. No performance in it, no calculation. "You are one of the most compelling people I have ever had in my studio, and I have had some interesting people in my studio." The corner of his mouth moved. This time it reached. A real smile, small and careful, and entirely unlike the controlled presentation he maintained everywhere else. "You are not what I expected," he said. "You said that on your 3rd visit. You said it like it surprised you." It did. He set the sketchbook down carefully. "I have dealt with human artists before, with civilians who move in our world. They fall into two categories: those who are afraid and hide it, and those who pretend not to be afraid when they are. You are neither. I am often afraid, Camille said. I was afraid tonight. My hands were steady because I have learned to keep them steady. That is different from not being afraid. Yes, he said. It is. He looked at her with those iron eyes, and she thought again about painting them, about the specific grey that was not quite silver and not quite slate, that had a depth to it that ordinary grey lacked. I want to ask you something. Asks. When I came to your studio and told you what the commission involved, what the risk was, you asked me what would happen to you if it failed. I told you I had made arrangements. I want to know if you trusted that answer, or whether you accepted the commission for other reasons. She thought about it honestly, the way she always thought about things, with the same methodical patience she brought to a canvas. Both, she said. I trusted the answer. You are not someone who makes promises carelessly. I understood that within the first hour of knowing you. But the other reason was simpler. She looked at her hands. The other reason was that what you described was important, not just to your bloodline. The Council of Pale Hands has been operating without meaningful challenge for decades, and the consequences of that are not limited to vampire politics. The things they control, the territories, the supply chains, the human world intersections, they affect people who do not even know this world exists. And someone needed to do something about it. You needed someone to do this particular thing, and I was the person who could do it. She looked up. I do not think that is naive. I think that is just the calculation I made. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, It is not naive. It is one of the bravest and most considered things I have heard in a very long time. Do not make it romantic, she said, though the word hung between them with a very specific weight after she said it. I was not aware that I was, he said, in a tone that suggested he was somewhat aware. Camille looked at her water glass. How did you find me? She asked. Originally, of all the artists who work in this world, I saw your painting of the Prague market. It hung in a private gallery that belongs to a vampire I trust, and I stood in front of it for a very long time. He turned the glass in his hands. You painted a world that most people are afraid to look at directly, and you made it beautiful. Not comfortable. Beautiful is different from comfortable. Beautiful acknowledges the darkness and makes it mean something. He paused. I thought that if you could do that with a street market, you could do it with a crest that had been forbidden from public view for 37 years. Camille thought about the painting, about the layers, about how she had hidden the crest in the third layer, below the midnight wash, so that it required the right angle and the right light to see, and how this had felt, while she was doing it, less like concealment and more like embedding something precious in the heart of a larger work, the way you would set a stone. It will hold up to the review, she said. Technically. The council's curators passed it, which means they authenticated it as a legitimate commission. They cannot now claim it is a forgery without admitting they failed to inspect it properly. I know. Something in his expression shifted. Camille, the review tomorrow is likely to go well. But there is a contingency I have not discussed with you. She waited. Seraphine is not going to accept a review outcome that removes her from power. She has been on the council for long enough that she has built redundancies into every mechanism that should limit her. If the code review proceeds correctly, it will begin to strip those redundancies away. She is aware of this. He set down his glass. She will attempt to find a way to prevent the review from concluding. The most available method she has is to create a situation that disrupts the proceedings, something that requires the code to suspend. What kind of situation? She will attempt to have me accused of an active blood law violation. Specifically, that my entry into the building, given the terms of the accord, constitutes an ongoing violation sufficient to suspend all other proceedings until it is resolved. His jaw tightened. The argument is not completely without merit, because the loophole I have been relying on is genuinely ambiguous. Lord Aldravian's support is critical, because he was present at the original signing and can testify to the coercion. But Seraphine will attempt to discredit him as well. What does any of this mean for tomorrow? It means the review will become extremely complicated, and there will be a period during which the outcome is genuinely uncertain. During that period, you will be in the building, and the council's enforcement arm will be looking for a point of leverage. He met her eyes directly. They may attempt to use you as one. Camille absorbed this, so the safe passage might not hold. In the letter of the code, it holds absolutely. In practice, if Seraphine is desperate enough, she may decide the cost of violating it is acceptable. A pause. I will not let that happen, but I want you to know the possibility exists, because you have consistently asked me to be honest with you about risks, and I intend to continue being honest with you. She looked at him for a long moment. This extraordinarily old, extraordinarily powerful, extraordinarily careful man who had shown up at her midnight studio because he had seen a painting of a market and understood something about how she saw the world. Corvin, she said. Yes, why does the crest include the cracked moon? You told me about the ancient vow it represents, the bloodline you made the promise to, but you did not tell me why you still carry it after they are gone. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, because a vow does not expire when the witnesses die. It expires when you decide it no longer matters, and that decision says something about who you are. I made that vow because it was right to make it, and the death of the people I made it to does not change whether it was right. He paused. I carry the cracked moon because I choose to remember, because to stop would be to say that the only reason to keep faith is if there is someone to see you do it. And I do not believe that. Camille said nothing for a moment, then she opened her sketchbook and began to draw. He watched her work in silence, which she had learned was one of his particular gifts, the ability to be present without demanding acknowledgement of his presence, and she drew the cracked moon as it appeared on the crest, and then she drew it as she understood it now, fuller, more complex, surrounded by the geometry of a promise kept across centuries. You will do something with this, he said. Eventually, she said. I do something with everything that matters to me. The statement landed in the quiet room with a weight she did not attempt to qualify or walk back. He looked at her the way he had looked at the drawing of himself. Like it was something worth keeping, the code review convened at noon in the council's inner chamber, a room that made the ceremonial hall look modest. Vaulted ceilings of dark stone, carved with the histories of bloodlines going back further than most recorded human history. A long table of black oak. 12 chairs representing the 12 council seats, one chair at the head. Traditionally empty during review proceedings because the chair belonged to whoever held the position of court arbiter, a role that had not been filled in 40 years. Camille sat to one side in the witness section, which had a low stone railing and a view of the full chamber. She had dressed carefully for this, in the same quiet, professional way she always dressed for gallery events. Dark clothing, no jewelry, good posture. She had her sketchbook in her bag, and she did not take it out. Corvin entered the chamber, and the temperature did its thing again. Seraphine's procedural argument began within the first 3 minutes, exactly as Corvin had predicted. The blood law violation claim, the technical ambiguity of the loophole, the suggestion that all proceedings should be suspended pending resolution. Lord Aldravian answered it. He did so in the unhurried manner of someone who had been anticipating this argument for approximately 37 years and had prepared accordingly. His testimony about the signing of the Accord of Three Shores was precise, detailed, and delivered with the credibility of a witness who had nothing to gain from his account and had established over centuries a reputation for exactly this kind of inconvenient integrity, the chamber argued. Camille watched and listened, noting the alignments, who spoke in support of which position, how the representatives of the smaller bloodlines positioned themselves, how the balance shifted as the hours progressed. She was building a map in her head of the political landscape, not because she needed it for anything immediate, but because she could not help it. Understanding systems was what she did. Around the 3rd hour, Lord Theron from House Seravolt called for a procedural recess. In the corridor outside the chamber, 2 of Corvin's people materialized at Camille's side with the efficiency of people who had been tracking her position continuously. She acknowledged them with a nod and kept walking toward the water table set up at the far end of the hall. She was halfway there when someone fell into step beside her. He was not one of Corvin's people. He was not one of the council's guards. He was a vampire she had not seen before, which meant he had arrived during the recess, which meant he had been deliberately positioned. He was slim and dark-suited, with the white hair that all vampires shared and pale eyes that were the specific shade of grey that meant old blood older than it looked. He smiled at her with the precise charm of someone for whom charm was a tactical instrument. "Miss Quinn," he said, "I represent certain interests that have a stake in today's proceedings. I wonder if I might speak with you privately for a moment." "You may not," Camille said pleasantly, without breaking stride. "I am a civilian witness under safe passage, and any approach to me outside the formal proceedings is a code violation. I am sure you know this, which means this is either a test of my awareness or the beginning of something I should be very concerned about. Either way, I am going to continue to the water table and then return to the witness section, and you are going to stop following me." He kept pace with her for 2 more steps, and then she heard, from behind her, Corvin's voice say a single word. Just his name, the vampire's name, said with the specific inflection of someone who is using a name to make a point about exactly how well they know who they are talking to and exactly how little patience they have for the current situation. The vampire stopped. Camille reached the water table, poured herself a glass and drank it. Without looking back, Corvin appeared at her side. He was doing the thing again, positioning himself between her and the direction the other vampire had come from. But this time she was too aware of what the feeling was that she got from this specific habit to pretend she found it merely protective. "Seraphine's emissary," he said quietly. "I assumed." She looked at her water. He was testing whether I could be separated from the proceedings, or potentially from some safe passage protections. Yes, it did not work, no. He looked at her profile. "I want you to know that I am aware you are entirely capable of handling that without my intervention." "I am," she agreed. "But I am also glad you were there. Those are not contradictory things." A pause. She heard something in the quality of his silence shift, like a key turning in something that had been locked for a very long time. "No," he said. "They are not." They stood for a moment in the corridor, with the procedural recess continuing around them, and the future of several decades of vampire politics proceeding through the closed doors of the inner chamber. And Camille thought about the painting she had made, the layers, the way the crest sat in the 3rd layer, waiting for the right light, and she thought about how some things needed to be seen from the right angle before they became clear. She thought she might be standing at the right angle. The review concluded 5 hours later, in the early evening, when the windows of the Victorian Hotel had gone from grey London afternoon to the dark amber of street-lit night. Lord Aldrevian's testimony held. The Code Review panel, constituted of representatives from 7 bloodlines not directly affiliated with the Council, upheld the finding that the Accord of Three Shores had been signed under coercion, rendering it void under the blood laws that predated it by 4 centuries. The technical challenge to Corvin's presence was overruled on the grounds that a void accord could not impose valid restrictions. Seraphine stood when the finding was announced. She stood very still for a very long moment, and Camille, watching from the witness section, thought she looked like something that had been prepared for this outcome for decades, something that had already done all the grieving for it in private, and that what it was doing now was simply the formal acknowledgement of a conclusion that had been approaching for a very long time. "The finding is noted," Seraphine said. Her voice was controlled, not defeated. Controlled. "I will be requesting a bloodline assembly hearing on the specific council conduct charges. That is my right under the code." "It is," said the panel's senior arbiter, "and it will be scheduled accordingly." Seraphine sat. She did not look at Corvin. She did not look at Camille. She looked at the far wall of the chamber with an expression that was entirely unreadable, and would probably remain so until she had decided what to do next. Corvin, for his part, received the finding without visible triumph. He had known better than to perform anything in this room, Camille thought. The victory was not in the celebration of it. It was in what came after, the rebuilding, the re-establishment, the long work of reintegrating a bloodline that had been sealed from the court for 37 years. He understood that. He had always understood that. After the chamber cleared, he found her in the corridor outside. "It is done," he said. "The review is done," she said. "The assembly hearing is not. Seraphine is not finished. No, but the foundation of what she built is. The rest is procedural consequence." He looked at her steadily. "You should go home, Camille." You have been in this building for 48 hours, and you have handled more court politics in that time than most humans encounter in a lifetime. I should go home, she agreed. I have 3 commission pieces due by the end of the month, and I have not touched them. She paused. Will you come and tell me how the assembly hearing goes? He was quiet for a moment. That could be several months away. I am aware of what several months means, she said. I am asking if you will come. Another pause, longer than the others, the kind of pause that was not hesitation but something more deliberate, the deliberate checking of something important before an answer was given. Yes, he said, I will come. She nodded. She picked up her bag from where she had set it against the corridor wall. She started toward the main staircase. Camille. She turned. He crossed the distance between them in a way that was very particular, measured, not urgent but intentional, and he stood close enough that she was fully aware of the specific gravity of his presence, the way it rearranged the air. The painting, he said, the real one. The one I asked you to make. I want you to know what it meant to me. Not as a commission, as a piece of work. She waited. It is the first time the Darkmoor crest has been publicly visible in 37 years, he said, and you put it there. You understood what it was well enough to paint it in a way that made it mean everything it should mean, not as a symbol of power, as a symbol of continuity, of something that survived. He paused. I have never had anyone understand something of mine that completely. Camille looked at him for a long moment. Then she did something she had not planned to do. She reached up and put her hand against the side of his jaw, her warm human hand against his cool marble-pale face, and she held it there for a moment, just long enough to mean something, and she said, You are not as hidden as you think you are. His eyes changed. Something enormous moved through them. Something that had been sealed away for a very long time, not by a blood law, but by his own particular brand of careful and patient restraint. He turned his head slightly and pressed his lips very gently to her palm. She felt it all the way through her. Go home, he said softly. I will come, she went. 3 months passed. They were not quiet months for the Darkmoor bloodline or for the Council of Pale Hands, and Camille followed the developments through the careful, encrypted communications that Corvin's people maintained with her. Brief, factual updates that she translated into the larger picture, because she had been in that chamber and understood the landscape they described. Seraphine's bloodline assembly hearing was contentious and expensive and ultimately decisive. The specific conduct charges, orchestrating the poisoning of allied bloodlines, holding Darkmoor members under a bloodlock as coercive leverage, falsifying the Council's official record of the accord signing, were each addressed in turn. The documentation Corvin had maintained for 37 years, the evidence he had preserved across decades in anticipation of exactly this process, was entered into the record in full by the end of the 2nd month. Seraphine had resigned her council seat. She had not been destroyed. She had not been exiled. She had been, in the language of the blood laws, formally censured and stripped of her council authority, which in the world of vampire politics was roughly equivalent to having the foundations of your house removed and being told the structure was still technically standing. It would take years to fully rebuild the alliances and territories that her machinations had disrupted. It would take longer to restore the bloodlines she had damaged. But the damage was acknowledged now, publicly and formally, and that was the first necessary condition for any of the repair. Corvin came to her studio on a Tuesday night at the end of the 3rd month. Camille heard the knock and felt something warm and immediate move through her chest before she even opened the door. She noted this sensation with the same honest attention she gave to everything, and she understood it clearly for what it was. He looked, when she opened the door, like someone who had been working for 3 months. There was a tiredness in him that was different from the tiredness she had seen in the hotel corridor, less weighted, more the tiredness of things completed rather than things endured. He also looked at her with an immediacy that said he had been thinking about standing in this doorway for the entire 3 months. Come in, she said. I have coffee and I have a new painting I want to show you. He came in and she watched him do the thing with the room, checking it, assessing it, making sure of it, and this time, she thought it was not just professional habit and not just the instinct of someone who had spent decades guarding against the next threat. It was also the particular attention of someone who wanted to know that a specific space was safe because they cared about what it contained. "Coffee," he said, with the tone of someone who had not had coffee in 3 months, and was more pleased about this than they were going to let on. She poured him a cup and watched him hold it. "The hearing is closed," he said. "I know. I read your message. The formal restoration of Darkmoor's court standing was recorded yesterday. The bloodline is no longer sealed." He looked at his coffee. "It is strange. I have been working toward this for 37 years. I expected it to feel larger. Things usually feel smaller when they finish than they felt while you were still fighting for them," Camille said. "The fighting is enormous. The arrival is just a place." He looked at her. "Yes, exactly that." She brought him to the far wall of the studio, where the new painting hung. She had been working on it for most of the 3 months, and she had not told him about it in any of her message responses. She had not wanted to describe it. She had wanted to show it. It was large, nearly 2 meters across. It showed the Darkmoor crest in full, the silver serpent, the black thorn crown, the 3 stars, the cracked moon, painted with the same layered technique she used for everything, so that it had depth and interior light, so that it seemed to glow from a source within the canvas rather than from the ceiling lights of her studio. But she had added to it. She had added the context it had not had before. The 3 stars set against the full northern sky, the thorn crown surrounded by the white flowers that thorns produce when they are in the right season. The serpent not constrained by the crown but moving through it, fluid and self-possessed. She had painted it as it should be, as what it actually was. He stood before it for a very long time. She stood beside him and let him look. "This is not the commission," he said finally. "No, I made this because I wanted to, because I understood it well enough to paint what it should have always been allowed to be." He turned from the painting and looked at her, and the iron eyes had that thing in them again, enormous and old and no longer sealed. "Camille," he said, "I need to ask you something. Ask. I am aware that I am an 800-year-old vampire who spent the last 3 months overseeing court proceedings and bloodline politics and the legal restoration of a name that was erased from official record by a criminal. I am aware that none of this is a conventional background against which to say something like what I am about to say." He paused. "I am also aware that I have been thinking about saying it since you put your hand against my face in the corridor of a Victorian hotel and told me I was not as hidden as I thought I was." Camille looked at him steadily. "I would like to know you better," he said. "Not as the artist who painted my crest. Not as the civilian I asked to do something dangerous for reasons I explained carefully. I would like to know you in the way that requires more time and more presence and more honesty of those things, and I would like to know if that is something you want." The studio was very quiet. The London night moved outside the high northeast windows. "Corvin," she said. "Yes, I painted you from memory," she said. "From a single image of you standing at that window. I painted you in a private sketchbook I kept under the work table, and when you found it, I did not apologize, because I paint what matters to me, and that was already true." She tilted her head slightly. "What do you think the answer is?" He crossed the distance between them with the same measured intentionality he had used in the hotel corridor, and this time he put his hand against her jaw, his cool, pale hand, and she turned into it the way she had turned toward things worth looking at her whole life, fully and without pretense. "I think," he said, "that the answer is yes." "Correct," she said, and she reached up and covered his hand with hers. And they stood in the studio with the painting of the Darkmoor crest glowing on the wall behind them, surrounded by the smell of turpentine and cold coffee and the particular London dark. And it was perhaps the most quietly momentous moment she had ever been in, which was saying something, given the recent past. He leaned down and kissed her, and it was the kind of kiss that was not impulsive or careless, that had been constructed over 3 months of absence and honesty, and the specific accumulation of things they had understood about each other. And it was, she thought, the exact right amount of everything. The assembly hearing's aftermath was not the end of things, because things in the vampire world rarely ended cleanly. But it was, as Corvin had said, an arrival point, and from that point life organized itself into a new pattern. He came to her studio twice a week. She came to his house in Kensington, a tall, narrow Georgian townhouse that looked from the street like the private residence of someone with impeccable taste and a preference for high walls, and which was internally a marvel of old-world architecture and modern comfort, books in 7 languages, furniture that had survived 3 centuries, windows fitted with specialized glass that filtered the specific wavelengths of sunlight that would cause damage while allowing the quality of light that made the rooms feel like inhabitable paintings. She painted the rooms. She painted the windows and the quality of filtered light, the way it moved across the old furniture, the way it made a vampire's white hair look like something poured rather than grown. She painted him with his knowledge. In the way that she painted things, she understood, with the layered attention that made the subject visible in 3 dimensions. He sat for her with the patience of someone who had waited decades for things, and understood that patience was not passivity, it was sustained attention, and he asked her questions while she worked, about her process, about what she was looking for when she mixed a color, about how she decided what to hide and what to place in the foreground. She answered all of them, and asked him equivalent questions in return, about the blood laws and their history, about the court politics he was now reintegrating into, about the bloodlines he remembered from before the exile and how they had changed. She was building her understanding of his world with the same methodical thoroughness she brought to everything, because she had decided to belong to it, not by transformation or by legal status or by any formal mechanism, but simply by the choice to understand it, to be present in it, to be his. He understood this. He did not ask her to be anything other than what she was. He was protective in ways that were sometimes excessive and occasionally required direct conversation, because she was Camille Quinn and she had strong opinions about her own capacity to handle things. And he was Corvin Darkmoor, and he had 8 centuries of instinct telling him to place himself between things he valued and the directions from which threats traditionally came. They found the calibration of this together, through conversation and disagreement, and the specific compromise of 2 people who each had enough self-possession to give and take without losing themselves in the process. She met his bloodline. A formal occasion, carefully arranged, in the Nadarksistata in the Scottish Highlands, which turned out to be an actual castle, which Camille had been told about, but which was still, upon arrival, genuinely affecting. She had worn good boots and brought her sketchbook and shaken hands with 37 vampires, who looked at her with varying combinations of curiosity, wariness, and the particular expression of creatures who were updating their understanding of their king in real time. She had handled it the way she handled everything that was new and slightly overwhelming, by paying close attention and saying only what she meant. By the end of the evening, the Darkmoor bloodline had collectively decided she was acceptable, which she had been told was not guaranteed, and which had taken considerably less time than some of Corvin's people had predicted. "You were excellent," Corvin had said afterward, driving back toward the city in the deep Scottish dark. "I was myself," she said, "which is all I know how to be." "It is the right thing to be," he said, and then, after a moment, with the particular tone that he used when he was saying something he had been thinking about for a while, "You know, most of them have never seen their king look at anyone the way I look at you." She turned to look at him in the darkness of the car. "And how is that?" He kept his eyes on the road. "Like you are the thing I was waiting to understand." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You told me once that a vow does not expire when the witnesses die. That keeping faith is not contingent on being observed." "Yes, I think I understand now what that means." She turned back to the window, to the highland dark, moving past. "I think it means that what you feel for someone does not need an audience to be true." He reached across and took her hand and held it, the cool marble of his fingers steady and certain around hers, and they drove through the Scottish night, toward the city, toward the studio and the townhouse, and the twin calendars of their life together, which was taking shape the way her best paintings always did, from multiple overlapping layers toward something that had depth and light. The Darkmoor Crest painting sold, in the end. Not to the vampire court, not to any institutional buyer. It was acquired privately by Lord Aldravian, who had it hung in the room where he kept the documents that mattered most to him, alongside papers from signings he had witnessed across centuries. the physical record of history as experienced rather than as officially recorded. He told Camille, through a formal letter written in a handwriting even more controlled than Corvin's, that the painting had reminded him that some things deserved to be visible, and that he was grateful for the reminder. She painted the solstice hall from memory, the ceremonial occasion, the 300 pale faces, the cold blue chandeliers, the moment of absolute silence when the curtain came down. She titled it simply, in the registry, Revelation. It became eventually the most discussed painting in a private exhibition she held the following year. Attended by both human and vampire art world figures, which raised a number of logistical complications that she and Corvin's people solved with characteristic pragmatic efficiency. The Council of Pale Hands reconstituted itself over the following year, with Seraphine's seat filled by a representative from House Cressholm, which aligned House Cressholm with the Darkmoor bloodline's interests in a way that reshaped the political landscape of the European vampire courts for the foreseeable future. Corvin did not seek a council seat. He had not wanted one before the exile, and did not want one now. He wanted the freedom to move, to manage his bloodline's affairs, to attend the court proceedings that required his presence, and to absent himself from the ones that did not. He wanted, he had told her, a life that was more human in its scale, which was an interesting thing for an 800-year-old vampire to discover, though she thought it made a certain sense. He attended her studio nights when she was in residence. He sat in the chair by the northeast windows and read or watched her work, and she stopped being surprised by how natural this was. How completely he had become part of the geography of her creative life, the same way that the quality of northeast light had become part of it, something she had not had before, and could no longer imagine working without. One evening in the spring, about 8 months after the code review, she was working on a large commission for a private gallery, and he was in the chair, and the filtered London light was doing something extraordinary in the room, and she stopped painting and looked at him in it for a long time. He noticed. He always noticed when she shifted from working to seeing. "What is it?" he said. "I am going to paint you in this light," she said. "Not from memory. From this. Right now." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "All right." She took a new canvas from the rack and set it on a fresh easel and began to work. She worked quickly, the way she sometimes did when the visual truth of something was very clear, and she wanted to capture it before the light shifted. And she painted him with the deliberate, loving attention that she brought to the things she intended to keep. He sat very still. He was good at that. He was, she thought, extraordinarily good at being present without demanding acknowledgement of his presence, and she thought again what she had thought in her studio on the first night he had visited, that this was perhaps the most surprising thing about him, that someone who commanded rooms by simply entering them had learned, or always known, how to be still. She worked for an hour in the fading afternoon. When she stopped, the room was darker, the London evening having arrived outside the northeast windows, and the painting was not finished, but the essential thing in it was there. He came and stood beside her to look at it. She looked at it with him. At the pale face in the filtered light, the iron eyes that she had captured in the specific grey that was not silver and not slate, at the quality of his presence on the canvas, which she had tried to paint not just as how he looked, but as how it felt to be in a room with him, the specific gravity, the depth, the careful authority of him. "You painted what it feels like," he said. "That is what I always try to do." She set down her brush. "That is what you hired me for 8 months ago, to paint what things feel like. What they mean. And what does this mean?" he asked, looking at the painting. She turned and looked at him, at the real version, standing beside her in the spring evening. "It means I love you," she said, in the plain and uncomplicated way underneath all the rest of it. The court politics and the blood laws and the ancient vows and the forbidden crests. Underneath all of that, in the third layer, where I put the things that are most real. She held his gaze. "You told me you wanted to know me in a way that required honesty. That is honest." He looked at her for a long moment with those iron eyes, and she thought that what was in them now was nothing like the tiredness she had first seen there, and nothing like the controlled authority of the court, and nothing like the careful patience of someone who had been waiting decades for the right conditions. It was something simpler and larger than any of those things. Something that had been building since a midnight studio and a drawing at the window and a hand against his face in a hotel corridor. "I love you," he said. "I have been wanting to say that with the directness you deserve for approximately 7 months. Why did you wait 7 months? Because I wanted to be certain I was saying it as a statement of what I know and not as a response to what I want. The distinction matters." Camille looked at him. "You are the most careful person I have ever met. I have had a very long time to become careful." "I know." She stepped toward him. "You can stop being quite so careful now." He reached for her, and she came to him, and the studio held them in the spring dark, smelling of turpentine and paint, and the particular quality of London evening that she had built her entire aesthetic around without knowing, until recently. What it had been waiting to hold. They were not a secret, eventually, not in the vampire world, where the King of House Darkmoor's relationship with a human artist was known, and, after the events of the Solstice Hall, was understood to be the kind of thing that was not going to be interfered with by anyone who valued their standing. Not in the human art world, where Camille's connections to certain private and somewhat opaque patrons were understood to be more than professional, and were generally respected as her business, and no one else's. They were simply visible, in the way that things visible in the right light are visible. The way that a crest in the third layer of a painting becomes clear to whoever knows how to look. Corvin attended her exhibitions. He stood in galleries in the way that he had stood in Lord Aldrevian's private collection before the commission, with the long, unhurried attention of someone for whom looking at something carefully was not a performance of appreciation but the actual thing itself. He understood her work, not in the technical language of art criticism, though he had accumulated, over 8 centuries, enough familiarity with the art of every period to speak that language if required, but in the way she wanted it understood, from the inside, from what it meant. She attended his court obligations with him when the occasion suited and when she chose to. She was not a consort in the formal sense, because the formal sense carried legal and political weight in vampire culture that they had agreed, carefully and extensively, to discuss before any formal steps were taken. She was his partner in the human sense, in the sense that mattered in every room they shared, which was that they had each chosen the other with full knowledge of what was involved, and that this choice was ongoing, and deliberate and renewed each time they walked into a room together, Lord Aldrevian told her. At a court gathering she attended with Corvin the following autumn, that he had seen a great many things in his considerable number of years, and that a king who looked at a person the way Corvin looked at her was a king with the kind of foundation that was extremely difficult to destabilize. "He looked like that at my painting first," she had said. "Yes," Lord Aldrevian had said, with the small, precise smile of someone who had been watching centuries of human and vampire stories and understood what they had in common. "That is how it often begins." The Solstice Hall Commission was retired from the ceremonial rotation, which Camille thought was probably for the best. The new painting commissioned for the following century's Solstice Hall was offered to her, through a formal request from the reconstituted councils. She considered the request for 3 days, discussed it with Corvin, and then accepted it because she thought there was something right about being asked to paint the hall a second time, now that she understood it better, now that she had more to say about it. The second painting took a year to complete. It was larger than the first, and the technique was, if anything, more layered, more complex, more alive, with the kind of interior light that she had been moving toward for her entire career. It showed the hall as it was, not in the moment of political confrontation, but as an architecture, as a space designed to hold the weight of immortal politics and ancient vows, and the ongoing complicated project of coexistence between creatures who had been alive long enough to forget what they had fought for and those who remembered it completely. She hid nothing in the third layer this time. Everything was visible, the Darkmoor crest and the crests of the other major bloodlines, and the human artist's mark that she had developed over her career. The small geometric signature that looked like a compass, rose if you knew to look, woven into the lower right corner. It was the first time a human artist's mark had appeared in the Solstice Hall. Corvin saw the finished painting before it was delivered. He stood before it for a long time, the same long and unhurried attention, and she stood beside him and watched him look. "You put your mark in it," he said. "I put my mark in all my paintings. Not the first one. The first one needed the crest to be the only mark. This one is different. This one is what the hall looks like when the history it holds has been acknowledged rather than hidden." She paused. "Including the part of its history that involved me." He looked at her. "You belong in it," he said, simply. With certainty, she reached for his hand. The studio was quiet around them, smelling of a year's worth of paint, and the particular quality of light she had come to think of as theirs. The filtered London light through high northeast windows, the light she had built her life in, and that had, in its most important application, illuminated something she had not known she was waiting to see. Corvin Darkmoor, the most careful man she had ever met, laced his fingers through hers and held on. The cracked moon on the crest in the corner of the new painting caught the studio light and seemed for a moment to glow from inside. Some vows she had learned did not expire. The ones made with full knowledge and complete honesty, the ones renewed by choice rather than maintained by obligation, those ones endured. Not because the world stopped giving them reasons to break, but because the people holding them understood that the breaking point was where the faith proved itself real. She had walked into a court with a secret hidden in a painting and changed the direction of several decades of vampire politics. She had done it because it was right, and because she could, and because a man with iron eyes had stood in her studio at midnight and explained an ancient vow with the patience of someone who believed that truth deserved to be heard carefully. She had not expected love to come out of it. She had not expected to find in a world of blood laws and immortal pride, and forbidden crests and old world codes, something that felt exactly like coming home. But she had painted with enough different kinds of light to know that the most surprising things were usually not the ones that arrived dramatically. They were the ones that had been there all along, waiting in the third layer for someone to find the right angle. She had found it, they both had, and it was, in every light, extraordinary.